Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Strengthening GRC, what the C-suite needs to know about emerging risks, value creation, and impact. So we'll be starting in a few minutes, just letting people get in the call. And maybe while we do that, just some general housekeeping rules. So we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentations of our speakers. So please don't hesitate to ask any question in the Zoom chat box or even on Twitter at Datamaran AI. And then we'll pick those and we'll ask the panelists those questions at the end of the presentations. If you have any technical questions or issues, same thing, please reach out to us via Zoom. Someone from the team will be able to help you. If really there's something else, you can also contact us at marketing@datamaran.com. And if we have some technical issues, please bear with us. Sometimes the internet can be a bit spotty, so apologies in advance if that happens, but hopefully everything will go well. So, and then just note that the event is being recorded as well. So I'm just going to look at the time. So it's 3:02. We're going to get started. And so to do that, I would just like, first of all, to welcome and thank our speakers today. Really excited and honored to have you on the call with us today to speak about that topic. So first, we have Will Wirtz, who is a partner at EY Advisory in the Netherlands. He focuses on large international companies. He's a specialist with decades of experience in the fields of risk management, internal auditing and control, compliance and privacy. Then we have Stathes Gold, who is the Director of Advocacy at the International Federation of Accountants, IFAC, and he heads up the development of international services for professional accountants working in business and industry. A key element of his work is developing thought leadership and guidance in support of finance professionals and their roles in facilitating sustainable organizational performance. And then finally, we have with us today Michael Torrance, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Bank of Montreal. He leads ESG and sustainability strategy and implementation. He has legal experience as a specialist in risk advisory on international standards of environmental and social risk management, as well as regulatory and governance aspects. And finally, I'm Maeva Charles. I'm the Partnerships and Technical Director at Datamaran. So I lead our work with our global partnerships and collaboration, so including the one that we have with EY on risk management specifically. I've been working at Datamaran for over 3 years, and before that I was working at Deloitte in their Enterprise Risk Services department in Montreal. So we'll get started. In terms of the agenda that we have today, we'll have different presentation. I'll be starting, then we'll have Will, then Stathes, and then Michael. And the main discussion points that we'll have today will be around the new form of external risk, how we can capture timely and accurate information on those type of risk, how to strengthen and accelerate the decision making around those as well, how you can have insightful reporting at speed thanks to technology, and how you can ensure a defensible process that meets investor expectations and their requirements. So with that, I'll get started with my presentation. So just in terms of, giving you a brief introduction about Datamaran for those of you who are not familiar with our company. So we're the market leader in external risk management. So we are a software as a service. We are used and trusted by Fortune 500 companies across the globe. We have various strategic collaboration around different use cases, including risk management with EY, as I mentioned earlier. And really the core of what we do is using AI and more particularly natural language processing and data analysis to support key business processes, strengthen and accelerate decision making. So really it's about using data that is out there, understanding what's the external environment to use that data for better decision making. And why we built Datamaran, in the first place is 6 years ago. The idea was really to provide a platform that helps our clients and our users to address those challenges and limitations to value creation. And it was already relevant 6 years ago when we started, and today, with a more and more complex world, but also in a more and more rapidly changing world, it's becoming more and more important, and certainly a must-have now for companies to have some process in place that can allow you to track those external issues. So here we have two examples of thought leaderships out there. One from the World Economic Forum, where they say what is financially immaterial today can quickly become material tomorrow, and you have to have some kind of forward-looking and proactive approach to be able to capture those. And then on the EY side, it reminds us as well that although that is the case, very often companies struggle to identify those external risks and also to quantify them and assess their likelihood. And the main reason of that is because, if we look at risk management, traditionally, it's really focusing more on those risks that can be quantified with, in monetary terms. So going beyond that is really, more difficult in terms of quantifying those and having the right data to be able to take decisions with those new kind of risks, or those risks that are a bit less traditional in the types of data they rely on. So in terms of how that's that is linked to Datamaran and the strategy of a company in general. So here it's kind of an overview. I wanted to take a bit of a step back and think, okay, so what, why risk management is important. So here at the core, we have the strategy. Then, in terms of strategy, you have different phases, and I've kind of summarized them here. But first, you have to define it, then you have to implement it, then you have to monitor it, and then communicate about it. And then it's kind of a circle where you have to, update your strategy over time. So, in terms of those different steps, really, getting a sense and keeping a pulse of what is important around you and around your organization externally, and not taking into account only, internal inputs, is very important in order to reach those different stages. So, in terms of definition, you'll have, a roadmap that you do maybe every 3 or 5 years, but that you can also, update and adjust throughout those years, in order to still reach your objectives. Then in terms of implementations, for instance, you could need to do or do mergers and acquisition, which is a process that a bit more ad hoc. And in terms of monitoring, internal audit is a very useful function, although it's not mandatory. It's something that a lot of companies are relying on to make sure that they have the right controls and process in place. And then finally, in terms of communication, you have your annual report and the external audit, that provides assurance on that report. So all of that is really, in a sense, related to risk management, because the strategy, if we look at those GRC pillars, so governance, risk management, and compliance, are really the things that will drive that strategy and the work around it. And those different key business processes that you see here are supported by Datamaran, in the sense that it provides you, one, with a robust process, and two, with the data to make the right decisions, or at least the very informed decisions. If we look at internal audit in particular, and how this is linked to annual report, one of our clients, Philips, says, you can only have reasonable assurance if you have good internal controls. So it's really, looking at not doing something just on a yearly basis, so where, yes, you're going to do your annual report every year, but it's also relying on everything that you do throughout the year. And for that, to give you a bit of a sense of what we do at Datamaran and what kind of outputs you can get out of the platform. So here you can see a matrix, which is seemingly not that impressive, but then you can see how you can use those information to feed into those different key business processes that I mentioned earlier. So if we look at the top right-hand side, these topics that you have are the ones that are the most important both from a likelihood standpoint and an impact standpoint. So the likelihood here in that case is something that will be determined using Datamaran's data, and the impact will be something that you will set up based on your knowledge and understanding of your organization. But those topics basically will be the ones that are the key priorities and that you will need to have in your strategic roadmap. If we look at the rest of the matrix in the middle, we can see those risks that are maybe a bit less likely, but there are also, an impact that is quite important. So this is where you'll have to kind of, determine the risk appetite and tolerance in a bit more structured way, I would say. And then finally, if we look at the ones on the left-hand sides, those are the ones with the most likelihood, but also the impact that has been assessed as being a bit lower. So we can see here actually that with one of the most recent function that we've launched of Datamaran, you're able really to track and understand how those issues are moving and how the likelihood is changing over time as well. So this is over a period of 6 months only. You can see that some topics have really increased. So geopolitical events by 7 ranks, solvency and economic value by 4 ranks, innovation and digitalization by 3 ranks. And then the tool also gives you, the source of those emerging risks, so you can understand how you can start to tackle those as well. So in the end, with that kind of, again, seemingly simple matrix, you can have a lot of insights as to how you can use that information to feed that into your key business processes. So that's it, on my side for now. I'm going to hand it over to Will, who is going to cover a bit more the aspect around risk appetite and what a robust risk management process looks like. But just before we do that, we're going to do a quick poll with you. So you should have a question that appears on the screen right now. So we'll let you answer. So does your company have a rigorous process for monitoring emerging risks? And just as you do that, I also wanted to give you a quick stats that I found in an EY study, where they say that before the outbreak of COVID-19, just 21% of boards were very satisfied with their effectiveness in overseeing changes to the risk landscape and adjusting their organization risk appetite accordingly. So that really links back to having that rigorous process in place. And if we look at the results that we have, it's also very mitigated in terms of how companies are currently addressing that and having that process in place. So thank you all for voting, and I'll hand it over to Will. Well, can you see the screen?
Oh, yeah, there I am. Yep. I was on mute and I could not unmute myself.
No worries.
I'm sorry for that. Yeah, I think you already shed a great light on the risk management of the future. But we first start talking about risk management of yesterday. And I think you posted a great question, and thanks for having me here to discuss that. Does your company have a rigorous process for monitoring emerging risk? My name is Will Weerts. I'm a risk advisory partner for EY in Amsterdam. So I quickly touch upon the dynamics in risk management. And although the emerging risk question may be pretty obvious, it's not an easy one to address. So if you have questions during my next 10 minutes, please, like Mieva said, drop them in the Q&A and we will be happy to answer them. So COVID-19 has shown us that the low probability, high impact scenario just has increased in severity and plausibility. So, and with that, we had data, we had analysis. There was a lot of information out there, but still it was overlooked by many, including myself. I didn't push very hard on that. So boldly said that we can conclude potentially that the risk management was asleep at the wheel or was blowing the horn and was not heard or potentially people didn't want to hear. So, and this is about external risks, so risks that someone cannot control, but might have in it that they can topple a business easy. The financial impact is big time. So, and if I look at, I'm a non-financial services partner. If I look at the companies I work with, they typically have, if I look at the setup of governance, risk and compliance, they typically have a governance and compliance committee that gathers a couple of times a year. The legal counsel is involved, internal control, internal audit, and then they advise the board. And then the board typically has a board session to discuss strategic risks, maybe 1.5 hours a year, preferably just in front of publishing the annual report. And then the level of granularity in which risks are discussed is pretty low. And the question is, if you look at the changing environment, the complexity we are operating in, the question is that still enough? Well, I guess asking the question is stating the obvious. We don't think at the moment that is enough. So your firm is exposed often to a broad set of risks. So it's no longer just the project risk of a large construction company. We have complex financial models. We are talking about digitization. We involve platform, service provider, we outsource, etc. So there is far-reaching dependency in the supply chain, in the organizations for others. And those are risks that are complex and we need to understand. And this also brings that risks are not only taken by the typical risk takers in the first line of defense. So we have new people starting to take risks, and that challenges the effectiveness of the 3 lines of defense model. So this could be the software dude coding some artificial intelligence and certain models that we would need to understand, or perhaps the shared service center provider that also has its own business model. Let alone that we nowadays promote entrepreneurial spirit with all our employees. So what will happen there? Do they continue to follow our guidance? So our meaning the company's guidance. So we are facing a couple of risks that might move differently than we are used to. The used to meaning the operational risks, like I mentioned, the supply chain, the construction company, and these new risks. COVID, you could argue whether it's new. These could evolve differently or in a way silently that we notice it late. Other risks to watch are for us, potentially Euro crisis. We are talking about climate risks. So how do you handle these risks and your risks that you typically cannot control yourselves? So this means that we think that, and we believe that we leave our companies vulnerable to what is happening in the world. So where was risk management? And that question is asked a couple of times. Where was risk management when these events started to happen? So I continuously get the question, what is the added value of risk management? So, is everything wrong in risk management, you would argue? So why are you speaking like this? I think the answer is no. So the companies made progress in certain areas. If you talk about anti-money laundering, if we talk about anti-bribery and corruption, even in cyber. But these are all areas that companies can control themselves. So we call those internal risks, downside risks. Cyber you can control to a certain extent. At least you can organize yourself for it. I think one of the things what we do see, and as a risk management professional, I'm always a bit jealous. These companies, these functions managing risk use data. They have tooling, and what we typically see is that risk management tooling and data so far has not been leveraged to a great extent, and that puts risk management behind. So the influence, the impact of the risk management function on, for instance, strategy, monitoring strategy, adding value is reduced. And one of the reasons is not leveraging data and being still pretty subjective. So, and if you put on top that we still spend quite some work and investment in the risk and control self-assessments, etc., you can still argue whether, is our existing risk framework and our approach sufficiently adapted to the changing business environment. So let me now move to tomorrow. So what's then risk management of tomorrow? And I think this is a very interesting sheet you have in front of you. It speaks about risk intelligence, and well, it's no surprise that Datamaran, it could be a part of that. And so if we look at the past, we look at people that say, we talk about black swans. Other ones speak about gray rhinos. Gray rhinos, for those that don't know, is our expected events with a high impact, but ignored. And black swans are unlikely events with a very high impact. So whatever you may call events like COVID or the potential climate risk or the potential euro crisis, it's going to happen. These events, to some extent, were unpredictable, are now more predictable. We can expect them, but risk management has been ineffectively handling these. And that is where the external data factor is coming in. So external data, using external data to monitor the outside world, to understand what's happening and what's coming towards the organization or the company, if you want. And here is an interesting quote a large chemical company shared with us, and I will read it. It said that the world is changing very fast, and the amount of information produced and generated is increasing exponentially. But the human brain simply cannot process that much information. So we need solid business processes and technology to scan what's going on in regulatory worlds, in corporate worlds, on social media, internet, etc. So these new tools that are out there nowadays and methodology can help us focus on the risks that really matter. So if you ask us, what's the future of risk management? And that lies in data-driven approach, focusing on the risks that matter, and typically also risks that companies cannot control themselves. So outside risks, and we call this approach, it says EY Risk Intelligence Engine, it's really starting to scrape the outside, so what's happening. It's real time, which might allow you to escalate matters, for instance, in terms of business continuity, to those that need to know, for instance, business continuity management. So scouting on Google is not enough, because external risk signals are there, but if there's only one person in a large international corporation doing that, it will not help. So that is where a company like Datamaran kicks in. They bring a systematic approach, they bring technology and an engine that can help you, screening the world outside in a structured and continuous basis. So together with Datamaran, and Maeve showed already, they also have an approach towards determining what's material for you, what's the really key risks, and together with them, you can determine what's happening there, and you can start actively and proactively monitoring that. I think I'm still good with time, Maeve, so...
yeah, you have a couple more minutes. Are you
minutes.
okay with that slide, or should I move to the
no,
next
this
view?
is fine. You can add you can add the rest of the boxes. I'm just talking
Okay.
around a bit.
Okay,
So,
I'll add them down.
I mentioned already that so we expect that data and technology will increase the added value of risk management, and we move efforts and investment to the outside world and not only looking to the risks we can control internally. So I mentioned just monitoring risks and escalate in case needed, but what is determining when is escalation needed? And one of the concepts that is then very relevant is risk appetite. And risk appetite is what COSO has defined is the risk, the level of risk, the amount of risk, if you want, an organization is willing to take in pursuit of value. And what I notice is that is often not very well defined. We screened 15 annual reports from 2019, and you will read comments like the risk appetite is high or medium or low. So it's more subjective, it's not very fact-based, and that is also where we strongly believe that tools and methodologies like Datamaran is bringing can support to make risk appetite, more and more fact-based. So when things in the outside start to happen, the company has defined its risk appetite and can make a very conscious decision that this is a risk we are willing to take on, or the company decides we are moving, we are ensuring, we are changing our governance, we are changing or adapting our technology and strategy. So long story short, we believe that concepts like risk appetite based on data can truly help a company dealing with unlikely events with high impact. So let me wrap up. Applying risk management based on tooling and technology will enable risk management to bring back the added value of risk management, and what we call then the true raison d'etre for the French among us of risk management, which means supporting leadership to navigate risks, to make better decisions and create long-term value for the company and for the stakeholders. So this is data. And next to that, I read a very interesting article in the Financial Times of the Netherlands talking about, data is nice, modeling is nice, and that's what I certainly encourage. You always need to ask the better questions, even if it's stupid, but that together with data will allow you to find the blue elephant in the room. I hope you find this interesting. If there are any questions or comments, we'll be very happy to address them in the Q&A. We are discussing our point of view on risk management and the future of risk management with CFOs. So if you're interested in having a conversation on this, please send me a message and I would be happy to participate. Maeve, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, it was really interesting to understand a bit more, the different components of what comes into play when we talk about risk appetite. So thank you for that. So we're going to go to our next speaker, but actually just before we do that, we have another poll for you. So the question this time is, do you see an opportunity to improve your company's risk management and reporting processes with the use of data and new technology? So again, another interesting statistics that I found around that from an EY study that was saying that only 40% of board directors and CEOs said that their enterprise risk management was effective in managing atypical and emerging risk. So again, it's that confidence in the board and executive members of having data that can really, provide information that makes them have the right decision and also, proactively manage those risks as we've just discussed with Will. So looking at the results of the poll, it seems like 90% of you think that data and technology can help. Some of you are not sure, 10%. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll be more convinced. So in terms of those results, that is actually, as you're going to present to us, you're going to talk about more about the landscape and practices that have evolved across the past few years and around those type of risks specifically, but also in terms of opportunities and how it impacts value creation. So over to you to present that a little bit more in detail.
Thank you, Maeve, and hello everybody, lovely to be with you. I don't recognize everybody involved today, but I see some friendly faces, so hello to you all. So I'm just going to take a little step back and just think about with you all, what do we mean by value creation and impact? There's a lot of discussion about ESG. What does this mean in terms of, managing your organization better and communicating? And so the real question is, what is value creation and impact in the first place? And what do you need to do to understand it and report on it? What information does one need? How do you get that information, and how does data help you get that information? And then what do you do with it? So I'll cover a little bit of all of that. it's nice as Phil. We got through maybe 10 minutes of the webinar without mentioning COVID-19, but I think unfortunately, it's with us. But the one positive thing about the whole situation is that you do sense generally a much greater focus, corporate focus on what is the purpose of business, and what are the opportunities and risks relating to value creation. So, I think that's only a good thing. But in what in my constituency is really thinking about how CFOs and finance teams expand their role and add more value in this broader space. And this is really important because, of course, a lot of businesses, the reality is a lot of businesses and a lot of CFOs and finance teams still predominantly measure success based on financial and shareholder value metrics. So, whether one is in the strategy, finance, sustainability, or risk management function, it just is really important, I think, to think about, if I'm going to be an effective business partner in this organization, what information and insights do I need to deliver, and how do I deliver that based on solid, fact-based and data-driven foundations? So the real question really is that, are we delivering the information that boards, management, and other parts of the company need to steer their organizations towards long-term value creation? So let's just think a little bit about what do we mean by value creation? Obviously, there's a very traditional sense of the word. That's, when you learn corporate finance, you have a very specific understanding of what value creation is, but actually, the way we're using it is really to describe, actually to just go back to the previous slide, is just to describe, how do we think about value beyond shareholders? So how are we creating insights? What are our insights today, and how we are creating value in the future across a range of areas? And then, how do we shift our thinking towards, how do we deliver towards stakeholder value and a wider set of stakeholder outcomes, and then that really calls into question, what are those non-financial capitals or resources that we really depend on as an organization to drive our financial performance? So, but ultimately, I think it's really important to sort of just acknowledge that this really is all about trying to ensure that we get to a place where we can have sustainable business models that, will create value through the long term to a wider set of stakeholders, and that we can, as an organization, protect value through tracking performance and value through measuring the right thing. So I think all of that will provide, whether you're a finance person, whether you're a risk person or sustainability person or strategy person, the basis of having a broader role in value creation and protection. So if you go to the next slide, what I'm going to just talk about really is what is value creation. So this is really, I think, quite important because there's so much discussion, as I said before, about using different terms, whether it's ESG, whether it's impact. Impact is a very gaining a lot of momentum at the moment. But if we put it all together, right, what are we looking at? So I'll just walk through this diagram. So basically, as we all know, about 80% or more of the enterprise value or market value of companies is hidden. It's not reflected in financial statements, in balance sheets, and financial reports. So it's really, I think that hidden value is what we're trying to capture, measure, quantify, monetize if we think we need to monetize. So that whole value creation process requires thinking about, well, what is it that's driving that value? What measures, indicators, financial, pre-financial information do we need related to, our book value, which most of us should be familiar with, particularly if you're an accountant or an investor? What is that business or enterprise value, which is very much an investor's perspective of a business, which is the potential for value creation. And that potential for value creation is driven mainly by strategic and intangible assets, intellectual assets, all of the stuff that is difficult to imitate, replicate, and that drives performance in terms of earnings and future cash flows and reduce risk for investors. But then there's this important piece, and very much what Bill was talking about, that whole sort of external focused piece where that's really represented by the societal value and the impacts that we have on people and communities around us. And these are not really tracked by a lot of companies and are not priced by investors in the market at this present time, but have huge impacts on our reputation and license to operate. So if we just look at this sort of business value, enterprise value perspective, I mean, these are a lot of the main areas that we're tracking to understand what are the prospects for our future cash flows into the company. You know, what is our potential for financial value creation going forward? So the kinds of things that we're tracking are performance and value drivers related to finance, operations, and customers. They'll be quite familiar. Relevant intangibles that drive strategic value, whether that's people, intellectual property, data, R&D, and innovation. And then this group of factors that Michael is very much going to talk about, which is ESG, which are increasingly used by investors and others. And they really represent opportunities and risks to value creation. But what the interesting thing is about all of those areas, when we think about enterprise value, is they track what we can control internally, and they're the private sort of gains and losses for the organization. So there's this whole new, really important piece that a lot of organizations are now thinking about, is how then do we link value creation to impact? Impact, so how do we understand our positive and negative impacts on customers, on employees, communities, and the environment? And how do we understand what value we're driving to society? So this is really, I think, an important piece of the puzzle, which sort of then brings into play, you know, what areas do we, you know, how do we quantify impacts? Do we need to monetize impacts? And there's a lot of organizations like the Impact Management Project and the Value Balancing Alliance that are evolving the thinking about how to understand impacts and then communicate those, and the evolving field of integrated profit and loss statements. I think it's, if you go to my next slide, when we think about enhancing, you know, the decisions we're making and the reporting, it's really about, and if we're going to be particularly relevant to investors, it's about integrating and trying to connect those value creation perspectives in a way where people can understand the interdependencies between financial and non-financials. And then, you know, how those sort of critical value drivers related to your risks and your opportunities then link to you know, the key financial drivers of performance, whether it's revenue growth, whether it's operational efficiency, brand and reputation equity, or cost of capital and risk. So that's really, I think, where the action is today and where most investors are trying to get to. And that's the kind of data I think both you know, people need in the organization to steer the organization towards long-term sustainable value creation, and what investors need to understand opportunities and risks of long-term value creation. And then in terms of how we use that data, particularly from a finance perspective, you know, if we're making decisions about or trying to measure and report the right things in terms of those top KPIs that we have in our management scorecards, as Will was talking about, how we incorporate that information in our risk management, in our financial and business planning, in our forecasting, in how we allocate our capital and our project investments, in our financing, and then in our reporting and communication. That's the only way we will actually get to a sort of a more integrated reporting and integrated thinking perspective. So with that, I'll sort of, hopefully we can pick up on some of the things I touched on in the Q&A, but I think Michael's going to talk a little bit more about how and what information investors need and are using.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Stathis. And yes, we had some questions coming in for you, actually. So we'll cover them in the Q&A. I'll go quickly to Michael, as we're running a little bit behind schedule. But Michael, so, whoops. So on your site, so you have just published your sustainability report and you have used Datamaran to conduct your materiality analysis, which the results and process have been reviewed by various of your board's committees, including the disclosure, audit, and review committees. So we're curious to hear a bit more about how you see that this process has evolved at a corporate level and how technology and data, like through Datamaran, has helped you increase the confidence of the board in that exercise of identifying and prioritizing non-financial issues. So I'll leave it over to you. I think you're on mute for now, Michael. There you go.
Thank you. I had to coordinate
Yes.
with the host there. Thank you very much, Maeva and Datamaran, for organizing this session. And thank you to my co-panelists, Will and Stathis, who really have set a great stage for understanding risk and then how it translates into value. And so my role, I'm Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO Financial Group, and we have an enterprise program around sustainability that cuts across various aspects of that and business processes, from disclosure to governance. I'm part of the corporate governance team. We also work with our lines of business on initiatives like sustainable finance, and environmental and social risk is also a core component of what we do. And so before I pivot to environmental and social risk specifically, which I think links most directly with this discussion, I just want to give an overview of why this type of issue, ESG, which is actually a subcomponent of the types of risks that we've been talking about, but it's a very complex one. And it's one that really ties into what Stathis was speaking about with respect to long-term value. And there's a basic, I think, theory behind this that there's no externalities anymore. That there was once a time where you could, and I think it ties into what Will was saying about the capacity of the human mind to, take in information and deal with it and make decisions based on it, leads us naturally to want to exclude certain things from being relevant to decision making. And there was once perhaps a time where you could focus purely on drivers of financial performance, and you could say that these things are not material for that purpose and therefore not relevant. And I think the major shift that's happened in the last 20 years is that really that is no longer the view, with all of the aspects of environmental and social sustainability that we know about. And this little map kind of shows you how many different topics that encompasses. If you just flip to the next slide, the idea though is that it is impossible for any one person to undertake an analysis of each of those issues in isolation. And so really data increasingly is becoming, in my view, the absolute driver of how we understand and assess both opportunities and risks from a sustainability perspective. If we go to the next slide, it ties into this idea of long-term value. There's actually some, it'd be nice to see someone maybe write a book about this or something, but it's interesting how this has evolved. But when you see the role of institutional investors, pension funds, index funds like BlackRock, you can really start to see the rationale why long-term value is tied to how well a company can manage stakeholder expectations, because these types of investors are in it for decades to come. And so risks associated with environmental and social issues may not manifest in the next quarter, but they could easily manifest over the coming years. And if you have that long-term perspective, there's really a convergence of the interests of the shareholder with the management of stakeholder expectations. And if we go to the next slide, this, as I think, builds on what Stathis was saying about the idea of intangible value. The Sustainable Accounting Standards Board has done some research about what this actually translates to for corporate value. And over the last 30 or more years, there's a clear increase in the intangible value, the brand value, the value of reputation for businesses over time. And if we go to the next slide, it shows that investors recognizing this are willingly committing to global standards to integrate ESG considerations into their investment decision-making. And that creates a feedback loop for companies to take these issues quite seriously and have increasingly sophisticated ways of managing these issues, but also finding opportunities. Which brings me to the next slide, the next couple of slides. BMO, just at a high level, we see this area from a risk perspective, but just to be clear, it's also about opportunities. There are business opportunities that flow from this. There's enormous demand from various stakeholders and regulators and governments to drive sustainable development in a certain direction. And that creates opportunities for investment, which I think just reinforces the desire for an understanding of this area. And if we go to the next slide, last year, BMO created a commitment to sustainable finance as an illustration of this, of $400 billion, which is tied to a re-envisioning of our purpose as an organization, which is to boldly grow the good in business and in life. And it's far more than a catchphrase. We've made some very significant commitments, and we're really therefore tying these types of ideas into our strategic vision as an organization. And I like to think of this as there's really purpose as a core aspect of what we do. Resilience, though, is also very important. And that's where I think the risk management aspect comes in. And then achieving impact is a third pillar of what we're trying to achieve. So if we begin to pivot now more to the risk side of things and move to the next slide, I think the real story here is around stakeholder expectations. It's important to recognize that there isn't a central authority that is going to be telling you what to do or what is expected of you. And so therefore it becomes very much a process of dialogue. It becomes a process to understand what the market expectation is, what good practice looks like, and where things are going. And so in the absence of a central authority who just tells you what to do and you just do it, as might have historically been the case with regulatory expectations, we have a globalized economy where that just can't and doesn't happen. Again, coming back to this idea of data and insights driven by data, that is going to be a really critical tool to understand what issues are important to your stakeholders, your critical stakeholders, and then use that to refine the types of processes and programs that you would create in your sustainability and environmental and social risk program. And on the next slide, regulators play a role. I've heard it referred to as basically being a topic that is in the shadow of the law. And actually, increasingly, we see regulators moving out of the shadows and creating expectations around topics like climate risk, for example. So there's been really interesting developments over the last couple of years where prudential regulators and others are looking at modeling that started as voluntary frameworks from, for example, the Financial Stability Board and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And they're looking at ways to integrate those approaches to stress testing programs that they would have oversight of. And that is, I think, a regulatory trend. There's also trends around sustainable finance and sort of setting foundational frameworks for how to think of sustainable finance and what it can or shouldn't be. But largely, this is still driven by more voluntary frameworks and good practice within industries. If we flip to the next slide, historically, in terms of the evolution of ESG, it started as a process that had to be narrowly managed on aspects of the business that you could develop a management system for, that you could do due diligence for, that you had enough information. So in the financial sector, for example, a leading framework like the Equator Principles focused very narrowly on certain types of project-based lending where information from data rooms and documents from clients could be reviewed and assessed, and then risks would be assessed in that way. And if we go to the next slide, but now the scope of risk management is much broader than that. And banks and companies are looking at, beyond transactional due diligence, are there ways that you can understand environmental and social risks right across your business relationships, from clients to suppliers? And that, again, you're dealing with thousands and thousands of potential pieces of relevant information. Having data tools and technology to help facilitate that integration is going to be critical, but then the integrity and quality of that information also then becomes a very critical question for the organization to ask itself in developing programs that rely on it. And at a portfolio level, something like climate risk is also, when you talk about stress testing or scenario analysis, as they call it, a very data intensive exercise that not only looks at individual aspects of, you know, loans or whatever they are, investments, but right across entire industries, right across geographies. And so the complexity is only increasing. And we are looking at ways to utilize internally AI and machine learning and other ways to synthesize the vast amounts of data that we would have in relation to our portfolio and marry it up with other information about potential topics like climate risk. And then the real critical issue becomes to come up with decision useful information from that kind of analysis. And that, I think, is something we haven't cracked yet, us or really anyone. And that is going to be the next, I think, goal, is to have common views around what relevant data should be applied to these questions and how to develop decision useful information. And so the next slide just is highlighting this idea of scenario analysis being one of the biggest challenges that we face from a data perspective. And maybe we'll just flip to my final slide, but to sort of frame again all of this type of work, as Maeva pointed out, we do, in accordance with the Global Reporting Initiative, an initial materiality assessment. And it's something that I think is an interesting evolution, and that I'll just use to conclude my points, that started as well as a very manual process where we would meet with stakeholders, we'd have focus groups, it'd be very time intensive, resource intensive, take quite a long period of time. We would do it very intermittently, about every 3 years. We found actually that in the 3 years since we did our last assessment, believe it or not, climate change didn't come up as a material issue when we did it back in 2016 for us as a bank. And that just goes to show how rapid the evolution can be in terms of stakeholder expectations. Now that would be a laughable conclusion, because banks and financial institutions are viewed as having a very important role in how they use their capital. It's not just about their own operations, but how they use their capital to facilitate the transition to a lower carbon economy. So, you know, being able to use data tools like Datamaran was a way for us to keep a more real-time and updated view of what material issues could be. And so we are going to be incorporating that going forward in our reporting and GRI process. So with that, I'll turn it back for the remaining minutes for questions.
Well, it looks like my colleague Maeva may have
actually.
Okay, Maeva, you were frozen,
Yeah.
so I was about to step in, but I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Susie.
Yeah.
So I was just saying we have a few questions. So actually a question for Status. So the question is, should we start to measure or calculate all values and the true price and cost of these in order to create the right insights for generating the need transformation in the sustainable business models?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I welcome other people's views. I mean, I think certainly there are a number of companies who are, you know, like the ABN AMRO, BSF. There's a whole group of them now that are experimenting and trying to not only measure but quantify and monetize. But certainly, I think if one, you know, thinks about circular business models and sort of true sustainable development, you do have to get to a place where you are able to understand your impacts in relation to planetary boundaries, thresholds, and carrying capacities. I mean, that takes you really to another level. And I guess when you know, people talk about, and the EU's talking about double materiality in that sort of term, well, there's financial materiality and then there's a sort of a wider societal materiality. I think that's where that sort of sense of double materiality is coming from. But that's the way I think about it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Stathis. So maybe a question that I had actually for you three, I think, is applicable to everyone, but, we've talked about data and technology a lot. We all recognize, the benefits of using that and applying that for better decision making. Despite that, you've all said, those are things that is not still, widely, and 100% of companies will have that process in place or that kind of technology and data to support what they're doing. So my question is, what do you think is currently the main barrier to that? And maybe, from Will on your side, regarding risk appetite, Stathis, if we look at, value creation, Michael, if we look at, the process in itself. So I don't know who wants to go first, but yeah, in terms of
Looks like she's frozen again. So I think the question was clear. Will, why don't we pass it on to you and I'll unmute you. Let's see.
Yeah.
There we
guess
go.
it's your risk management to mute me, so it's. I think risk management approach is still pretty traditional. It's risk management often is staffed. If I look at how we staff risk management functions by people that come from audit, have an audit background, move into internal control, into risk management. And then we typically fall into our old behavior and start to look into the risks that we know and that we can control ourselves. So that's one thing. And that is, of course, also fed by that, we were, I'm 22 years in auditing and risk management, etc. And 22 years ago, we already applied analytics. The data was always difficult. It was difficult to gather data, difficult to crunch data. But we are now first of all, more data is available. The quality of data, like Datamaran is providing, is much better than in the past. So, the whole reliance on data is improved. You can better rely on data than in the past. But second, we are now, my younger colleagues who are graduated in mathematics, they know how to deal with data. They can truly crunch data, where in the past there were just a couple, and now there are tons on the market that can do it. So I think so it's a bit of a legacy that we are now, let's say, we are growing over. That's my reflection. But
right.
Happy to hear other views.
Thank you, Will. Stathis, so Michael, anything to add on that?
Yeah, the only thing I would say very quickly is that just to reinforce Bill's point, risk management now is about managing uncertainty, and so the critical thing is to have that relevant information and data at the time of making decisions and when formulating your goals and targets. The old approach of coming up with a risk register after you've made all your decisions and you've created your strategy and your plans is totally pointless. So I think risk management is moving forward in that direction, particularly with the younger generation.
Yeah, and maybe I can add to that is that so I think the people that should be in risk management should have more business background. So that's one thing. Mm-hmm. And yeah, data is available. That's basically it, and we know how to crunch data. So I had another point, but I lost it. Sorry.
All right, Michael, maybe anything else to add on your side?
Yeah, just one thing that I've observed in terms of trying to get a broader scope of risk management. One of the big challenges is there's quite a burden on organizations to do this well. Mm-hmm. And so there is a natural, and I think rightly, there's an intention to try to reduce the number of questions, the number of processes, to try to streamline, to make things more efficient. And so whenever you're broadening out and adding new things, I think that is just a difficult thing to reconcile. So just from an institutional, cultural perspective and really trying to have a good sense of why you're doing what you're doing is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. Those are definitely things that, you know, are worth
And maybe
taking into consideration. Yep.
maybe to add, I think what I'm always surprised to see is that typically the internal audit function is way better equipped and staffed than the second line of defense, talking about risk management and internal control. So I always encourage my clients to invest more in risk management and control, less in internal audit. So that also, you know, if you don't invest a lot, because typically risk management, even in large corporates at headquarters, is 1, maximum 2 FTEs. And then they have a liaison or a change agent in the business. Yeah, that's, you know, investing more, and then investing in the tooling that can capture the data, that can work with the data, instead of, you know, just investing in software to track and trace controls. To me, that makes more sense.
And you need people who are able to use those data as well and understand the business background of it as well.
Yeah,
definitely. Great, thank you all. So, so we're reaching the top of the hour, so I'm just going to wrap up a little bit and look at some key takeaways that I wanted to mention. Yeah, so, you know, we've talked about risk, we talked about opportunities. In the end, you know, it's really in terms of, you know, how to make the business more resilient. And there's, you know, 3 main things I think that we can take out of this. So first, data and technology that can strengthen decision making, proactive monitoring that can support a more dynamic approach, and then auditable controls that also ensure trust and credibility. We haven't touched upon that much, but it's also, you know, with all that data, basically, you know, it really gives you that audit trails that also facilitate that process and gives more confidence in the information that you're putting out there as well. So, so I think that's it for today. Thank you all for joining. If you do have additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can also find some additional resources on our website, on our Twitter as well. We're also on LinkedIn. But yeah, thank you very much to our 3 speakers today. That was great to have you all on the call, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and hopefully we'll be back in touch soon. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye.